Okay, so ready to dive into atomic habits.
Absolutely. Always excited to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, it seems like everyone's talking about it these days, but for good reason, right?
Right.
So we asked you guys to read Atomic Habits by James Clear, and let us know what questions you had for this deep dive.
Yeah, what really resonated?
And hopefully we can answer some of those tougher questions today.
Yeah.
So for those of you who maybe haven't cracked open Atomic Habits yet,
Hmm.
Clear's basic premise is that it's not about making these huge, sweeping changes in our lives.
Right.
It's these tiny little improvements
Atomic habits.
that can lead to really remarkable results over time.
Exactly. 1% better each day.
And he should know, right? He kind of used these principles himself to recover from
Yeah, he has an incredible story.
a pretty horrific accident. So I think that's what makes this book so compelling, is that he's not just some,
Right.
guru on a mountaintop.
Yeah.
He's someone who's actually lived these principles and seen the results firsthand.
Yeah, it makes it relatable because it's like, okay, so it's not like you have to make this huge, drastic change. It's
Yeah.
literally those tiny little things that compound over time.
So let's unpack that a little bit, this idea that small changes can have this huge impact.
Yeah,
Because I think it can be kind of hard to wrap your head around at first.
absolutely.
It's like really just 1% better every day.
Well, think about it this way. You know how they say, like, money makes money?
Right.
It's the same concept with habits, good or bad.
Okay.
Like, if you improve just a little bit each day, those gains compound, and before you know it,
Yeah.
you're miles ahead of where you started.
So it's like that snowball effect.
Exactly.
It starts small, but then it just keeps building and building.
And momentum is key, right? Like, once you start seeing those small wins, you're more likely to stick with it.
So it's almost like you kind of trick yourself into making progress.
In a way, yeah, because our brains love rewards.
Yeah.
So even those tiny improvements register as wins, and that keeps us motivated.
So I'm curious, what are some of the ways that people can actually apply this in their own lives? Because I think sometimes
Yeah.
we hear these concepts and we're like, okay, that's great, but how do I actually do that?
Yeah, no, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
So let's take an example. Like, let's say you want to start reading more.
Okay.
Instead of saying, I'm going to read for an hour every day, start with just one page.
Just one page.
One page, that feels achievable.
Right.
And then tomorrow, maybe you read 2 pages and so on.
So you're not overwhelming yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're starting small and gradually building that habit.
So it's about consistency over intensity.
100%.
I like that.
Yeah, because you're much more likely to stick with something that feels manageable.
Now, what about that period where
Mm-hmm.
you're putting in the work, but you're not really seeing those big results yet?
Yeah.
In the book,
Oh, yeah.
Clear talks about this plateau of latent potential.
Yes. That's a big one. And it's so real, right? Because it can be so discouraging.
Right.
Like, you're putting in all this effort, but the scale isn't moving, or
Yeah.
you're not seeing that business growth.
Right.
And it's easy to just give up and say, oh, well, this isn't working.
Right.
But that's the thing. It is working.
So how do we push through that? How do we stay motivated when we feel like we're kind of stuck?
Well, Clear uses this great analogy of an ice cube.
Okay.
So imagine you're holding an ice cube in your hand and you're slowly applying heat to it.
Okay.
For the longest time, nothing seems to happen, right?
Right.
The temperature is rising, but the ice cube is still an ice cube.
Mm-hmm.
But then all of a sudden, you hit that critical point, 32 degrees, and boom,
Yeah.
the ice melts.
It all changes?
Exactly. And it's the same with our habits.
Interesting.
We might not see those big overnight transformations,
Right.
but all that effort we're putting in, it's not wasted. It's building up to that point where things finally click.
So patience is key here.
Patience is huge.
It's not a sprint. It's a marathon.
Exactly.
And we need to trust the process.
Trust the process. I love
Yeah.
that.
All right. So we've talked about the power of small changes. We've talked about the plateau.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other key takeaways from Atomic Habits that our listeners should keep in mind?
But I think one of the biggest ones is this shift from goals to systems.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Because so often we get caught up in setting these big, hairy, audacious goals.
Right.
Which is great, and we need to have a vision, but
Mhm.
Clear argues that it's the systems we put in place that actually get us there.
So it's not just about the destination.
Exactly. It's about the journey and the daily habits that move us in the right direction.
So give me an example of that.
Okay, so let's say your goal is to write a book.
Okay.
A lot of people get stuck there, right? They have this big goal, but they don't have a system for actually making it happen.
Right.
So instead of focusing on finishing the book, focus on building a system for writing every day.
So like maybe setting aside a specific time to write.
Exactly. Or creating a word count goal for each day.
Okay.
It's about breaking down that big, overwhelming goal into smaller, more manageable actions.
So it's almost like creating a roadmap.
Yes. And then it's just about following the roadmap one step at a time.
And I think that's something that a lot of us can relate to, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Feeling overwhelmed by these big goals.
Yeah.
But when we break them down into smaller steps, it suddenly feels a lot more doable.
100%.
All right, so shifting from goals to systems, that's a big one.
Huge.
What else? What other kind of like golden nuggets can we pull out of Atomic Habits?
Well, Clear talks about the 4 laws of behavior change, which is basically a framework for understanding how habits are formed.
So let's break those down because I think that's really where the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely.
It's like, okay, we understand these concepts, but how do we actually put them into practice?
Exactly. So the first law is make it obvious.
Okay.
So if you want to build a good habit, you need to make the cue for that habit really obvious.
Like a visual reminder.
Exactly. Like if you want to drink more water, leave a water bottle on your desk.
Okay.
Or if you want to meditate in the morning, lay out your meditation cushion the night before.
So it's about making those good habits easy to start.
Exactly. The second law is make it attractive.
Okay, so how do we make a habit attractive?
Well, our brains are wired to seek out pleasure and avoid pain.
Right.
So we need to find a way to make those good habits appealing, like pair them with something we enjoy or reward ourselves afterwards.
So like if you don't particularly enjoy going to the gym,
Yeah.
maybe you listen to your favorite podcast while you work out.
Exactly. Or you treat yourself to a healthy smoothie afterward.
Okay, like that.
The third law is make it easy.
Okay.
So we want to reduce the friction associated with those good habits.
So make them as frictionless as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like if you want to cook more meals at home, chop up your veggies in advance.
Okay.
Or if you want to go for a run in the morning, lay out your workout clothes the night before.
So you're removing those barriers.
Exactly. And the fourth law is make it satisfying.
Okay.
So we want to make sure those good habits have a rewarding feeling associated with them.
So we're more likely to repeat them.
Exactly. So we could use a habit tracker to track our progress. Or we could celebrate our wins along the way.
So it's almost like we're hacking our brains
In a way.
to make those good habits stick.
Exactly. And the good news is that these laws work both ways.
Oh, yeah.
So just as we can use them to build good habits, we can also use them to break bad habits.
So it's like a 2-for-1 deal.
Exactly.
I love it. Okay, so those are some really practical tips that people can start using today
Absolutely.
to build better habits and break bad ones.
Yeah, and the key is to just pick 1 or 2 to focus on at a time.
Right. Don't try to do everything at once.
Exactly, because that's a recipe for overwhelm.
Right.
Start small, be consistent, and celebrate your wins along the way.
I love it, right? So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, we have.
But I think the biggest takeaway is that building better habits doesn't have to be this monumental task. It's about making small, sustainable changes that add up over time.
1% better each day. That's all it takes.
And remember, you don't have to do it alone.
Absolutely not.
We've got an amazing community here to support you every step of the way.
That's right. We're all in this together.
All right, so keep those atomic habits building, and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we talked about those tiny changes and how they can really add up over time.
Yeah, like compound interest for your habits.
Exactly. But I think one of the things that can really trip people up is this idea of setting goals.
Oh, yeah. Goals can be tricky.
Because on the one hand, we're told we need goals, right?
Right. Gotta have a vision, right?
But then Clear comes along and he's like, goals are actually overrated.
Well, he's not saying they're totally useless, but he's saying we tend to focus on them too much.
At the expense of the process.
Exactly. It's like we get so fixated on the destination that we forget to enjoy the journey.
Or even worse, we get so overwhelmed by the thought of the destination that we never even start the journey.
100%. It's like that saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
But sometimes that first step feels impossible.
Right. And that's where systems come in.
Okay, so let's talk about systems.
So instead of focusing on the goal itself, like I want to lose 10 pounds,
Okay.
focus on building a system that supports that goal.
So like meal prepping or tracking your calories.
Exactly. Those are systems. And the beautiful thing about systems is that they take the pressure off of that end goal.
Because you're focused on the process, not the outcome.
Right. It's like you're putting one foot in front of the other and trusting that you'll eventually get there.
And that can be really freeing.
Absolutely. Because it takes that pressure off of having to be perfect.
Because let's face it, none of us are perfect.
Not even close.
And I think that's something that Clear emphasizes in the book.
hmm
It's not about being perfect. It's about being consistent.
Consistency is key because even small actions repeated consistently over time can lead to massive results.
So it's not about those big, grand gestures.
Nope.
It's about those small, daily habits.
Exactly, like brushing your teeth or making your bed.
Those things seem so insignificant.
Right. But they create a sense of order and discipline.
And they contribute to this overall sense of identity.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Because Clear talks about how it's not just about doing the habit. It's about becoming the kind of person who does the habit.
Yes. Identity-based habits.
So instead of saying, I'm trying to quit smoking,
You say I'm a non-smoker.
because that's a part of your identity now.
Exactly. And our brains crave that sense of congruence between our actions and our beliefs.
So when we identify as someone who does a certain habit,
It becomes a lot easier to actually do it.
it's like we're no longer fighting against ourselves.
Right. It's like you're finally aligned.
And that can be really powerful.
Absolutely. It's like you're no longer swimming upstream.
You're going with the flow.
Exactly. And that's where the magic happens.
All right, so we've talked about systems, we've talked about identity.
Mm.
What are some other practical tips that people can use to shift from that goal-oriented mindset?
Okay, so one thing Clear talks about is the importance of making our habits obvious.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, one way is to use what he calls implementation intentions.
Implementation intentions.
It's basically a fancy way of saying if this, then that.
Okay, I like that. Keep it simple.
Right. So, for example, if you want to start meditating every morning,
Okay.
your implementation intention might be, when I wake up, I will meditate for 5 minutes before I check my phone.
So you're creating that link.
Exactly. You're making it clear to your brain when and where that habit is going to happen.
And that removes the guesswork.
Right. It's no longer a question of, should I meditate today? It's just what you do.
It's automatic.
Exactly. And another thing Clear talks about is the importance of environment design.
Okay, let's talk about that because I think a lot of people underestimate the power of our surroundings.
Oh, yeah. Our environment plays a huge role in shaping our habits.
So how can we use that to our advantage?
Well, think about it this way. If you're trying to eat healthier, but your kitchen is stocked with junk food, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Because you're surrounded by temptation.
Exactly. So one of the best things you can do is to make those healthy choices more visible and accessible.
So like putting a bowl of fruit on the counter.
Exactly. Or prepping your meals in advance.
So you're not tempted to order takeout.
Right. And on the flip side, you want to make those unhealthy choices less visible and accessible.
So hide the junk food.
Out of sight, out of mind.
And it's not just about food, right?
Right. It applies to everything. Like if you're
Mhm.
trying to reduce your screen time, put your phone in another room.
Or use an app blocker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're basically making it harder for yourself to engage in those bad habits.
So you're increasing the friction.
100%.
Yeah.
And the more friction you can create.
The less likely you are to give in.
Exactly.
I love it. All right, so environment design, that's a big one.
Huge.
What else? What other nuggets of wisdom can we share with our listeners? So we've talked about making those good habits obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying.
Right. Like setting ourselves up for success.
Exactly. But what about those bad habits, the ones we're trying to break? How do we make those less appealing?
Well, Clear talks about this idea of increasing friction, making those bad habits more difficult to perform.
Okay, so it's like the opposite of making good habits easy.
Exactly. For example, let's say you're trying to cut back on social media.
Something I think we can all relate to.
Right. So instead of having those apps right there on your home screen.
Tempting you all day long.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bury them in a folder, make them harder to find.
So you have to think twice before you open them.
Exactly. Or better yet, delete them altogether.
I know, radical, right?
But it works. And it's not just about our digital environment either.
Right, it's about our physical environment, too.
Exactly. Like if you're trying to eat healthier, don't keep junk food in the house.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. Or if you want to watch less TV.
Move it out of the bedroom.
Exactly. The key is to make those undesirable behaviors less convenient.
So we're less likely to give in to temptation.
Exactly. Now, on the flip side, we can use environment design to make good habits more attractive.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, one way is to use what Clear calls temptation bundling.
Temptation bundling. Okay, that sounds interesting.
Basically pairing something you want to do with something you need to do.
Okay, give me an example.
So let's say you love watching Netflix, but you should be exercising more.
In there.
You could try only allowing yourself to watch Netflix while you're on the treadmill.
Oh, I like that. So you're kind of tricking yourself into doing the thing you know you should be doing.
Exactly. You're making those good habits more appealing by associating them with something you enjoy.
So it's not just about willpower anymore.
Right. It's about being strategic and setting up your environment for success.
Because our environment can either work for us or against us.
100%. And the more we can optimize our environment to support our goals.
The easier it will be to build those healthy habits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that Claire talks about is the importance of finding the sweet spot for motivation.
Okay, tell me more about that.
He calls it the Goldilocks rule.
The Goldilocks rule, like the porridge.
Exactly. It's that idea of finding the perfect balance between too easy and too hard.
Because if something's too easy, we get bored.
Right. And if it's too hard, we get discouraged.
So we need to find that sweet spot where we're challenged just enough to stay engaged.
Exactly. And this applies to everything from our workouts to our work projects.
So how do we know if we're in the Goldilocks zone?
Well, Claire suggests aiming for a level of difficulty where you have about a 50% success rate.
So half the time you're succeeding and half the time you're failing.
Exactly. Now, I know that might sound counterintuitive.
Right, because we're so conditioned to think that failure is a bad thing.
Right. But the truth is, failure is just feedback.
It's an opportunity to learn and grow.
Exactly. And when we embrace that, we're more likely to stick with it.
Because we know that setbacks are just a part of the process.
Exactly. And the more we can reframe failure as a learning opportunity,
The more resilient we'll become.
100%. Now, speaking of resilience, Clear also talks about the importance of showing up consistently.
Because consistency is key, right?
Absolutely. He says that missing once is an accident, missing twice is the start of a new habit.
So we need to be careful about those little slip-ups.
Right. Because they can easily turn into bigger slip-ups.
And before we know it, we're back to our old habits.
Exactly. So it's important to have a plan for when we fall off track.
Because we all fall off track sometimes.
Every single one of us. The key is to get back on track as quickly as possible.
And not beat ourselves up about it.
Exactly. We're all human. We're all going to make mistakes.
The important thing is to learn from them and keep moving forward.
I love that. So to wrap this up, I think the biggest takeaway from Atomic Habits is that building better habits is not about willpower or motivation.
It's about understanding the science of how habits work.
Exactly. And then using that knowledge to design our environment and our systems to support our goals.
Because when we do that, we set ourselves up for success.
100%. And the best part is, even small changes can make a big difference over time.
So true. This has been such a great discussion. Thanks for breaking down Atomic Habits with me.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
And for our listeners, remember, building better habits is a journey, not a destination.
It's about progress, not perfection.
So be patient with yourself, stay consistent, and keep those atomic habits building. Till next time.
See you then.